A spitehouse is a building constructed or modified to irritate neighbors or other parties with land stakes. Spite houses often serve as obstructions, blocking out light or access to neighboring buildings, or as flamboyant symbols of defiance. Because long-term occupation is at best a secondary consideration, spite houses frequently sport strange and impractical structures. Spite houses are much rarer than spite fences. This is partially attributable to the fact that modern building codes often prevent the construction of houses likely to impinge on neighbors' views or privacy, but mostly because fence construction is far cheaper than home construction. Examples: in 1716, Thomas Wood, a sailmaker, built a home in Marblehead, Massachusetts, which subsequently received the sobriquet of the Old Spitehouse. One theory has it that it was inhabited by two brothers who occupied different sections, would not speak to each other, and refused to sell to the other. In another explanation for the presently occupied 10-foot wide home, which is just tall enough to block the view of two other houses on Orme Street, the builder was upset about his tiny share of his father's estate and his revenge was a house built to spite his older brother's views. The Old Spitehouse is still standing and occupied. In 1806, Thomas McCobb, heir to his father's Phippsburg, Maine land and shipbuilding business, returned home from sea to discover that his stepbrother Mark had inherited the family mansion in the wilderness. Upset about his loss, McCobb built a home directly across from the McCobb mansion to spite his stepbrother. The National Park Service's Historic American Buildings Survey photographed and documented the 1925 move of the McCobb Spitehouse by barge from Phippsburg to Dead Man's Point in Rockport, Maine. In 1814, Dr. John Tyler, an eminent ophthalmologist and the first American-born physician to perform a cataract operation, owned a parcel of land near the Courthouse Square in Frederick, Maryland. The city made plans to extend Record Street south through Tyler's land to meet West Patrick Street. In fighting the city, Tyler discovered a local law that prevented the building of a road if work was in progress on a substantial building in the path of a proposed road. To spite the city, Tyler immediately had workmen pour a building foundation, which was discovered by the road crews the next morning. In 1830, John Hollandsborough's home in Alexandria, Virginia was one of two homes directly bordering an alleyway which received an annoying amount of horse-drawn wagon traffic and loiterers. To prevent people from using the alleyway, Hollandsborough constructed a 7-foot wide, 25-foot deep, 325 square foot, two-story home using the existing brick walls of the adjacent homes for the sides of the new home. The brick walls of the Hollandsborough Spitehouse living room have gouges from wagon wheel hubs, and the house is still standing and occupied. In 1839 or 1840, Edgar Allan Poe, in his story The Businessman, wrote the following humorous passage in the voice of Peter Prophet, a man who imagines himself a legitimate businessman although the reader realizes that he is a con man. Prophet's attempted scam in this passage is to build a spitehouse and extort his neighbors to pay him to tear it down. Whenever a rich old hunks, or prodigal heir, or bankrupt corporation, gets into the notion of putting up a palace, there is no such thing in the world as stopping either of them, and this every intelligent person knows. The fact in question is indeed the basis of the eyesore trade. As soon, therefore, as a building project is fairly afoot by one of these parties, we merchants secure a nice corner of the lot in contemplation, or a prime little situation just adjoining or tight in front. This done, we wait until the palace is halfway up, and then we pay some tasty architect to run us up an ornamental mud hovel, right against it. Or a down east or Dutch pagoda, or a pigsty, or an ingenious little bit of fancy work either Esquimau, Kickapoo, or Hottentot. Of course, we can't afford to take these structures down under a bonus of 500%. Upon the prime cost of our lot and plaster. Can we? I ask the question. I ask it of businessmen. It would be irrational to suppose that we can. And yet there was a rascally corporation which asked me to do this very thing this very thing. I did not reply to their absurd proposition, of course. But I felt it a duty to go that same night, and lamp-black the whole of their palace. For this, the unreasonable villains clapped me into jail. and the gentlemen of the ice saw trade could not well avoid cutting my connection when I came out. In 1874, two brothers in the north end of Boston, Massachusetts got into a dispute. Each has previously inherited land from their deceased father. While the second brother was away serving in the military, the first brother built a large home, leaving the soldier only a shred of property that the first brother felt certain was too tiny to build on. When the soldier returned, he found his inheritance depleted and built a wooden house at 44 Hull Street despite his brother by blocking the sunlight and ruining his view. The outside of the house spans 10.4 feet and tapers to 9.25 feet in the rear. The skinny house is still standing and occupied. In 1880, Adam Schilling owned a tract of 80 acres adjoining the town of Hiawatha, Kansas. Schilling sold 3/4 of an acre of this land, on which a house eventually was built and became owned by James Falloon. Together, the 80 acres were well suited to be added to the town of Hiawatha, but Falloon refused to sell Schilling his 3/4 of an acre at the low price offered by Schilling. To spite his neighbor, Schilling then built a cheap tenement house on his own property 13 feet from Falloon's with the oppressive and unlawful idea of rendering Falloon's home obnoxious and unendurable to Falloon and family by renting to people whom Falloon might find objectionable. The Richardson Spite House in New York City at Lexington Avenue and 82nd Street was built in 1882 and demolished in 1915. It was 4 stories tall, 104 feet wide, and only 5 feet deep. Joseph Richardson, the owner of the plot, built it after the owner of an adjacent plot, Hyman Sana, unsuccessfully tried to purchase the land. Sana considered the plot useless by itself and offered only $1,000. Richardson demanded $5,000. After the deal fell through, Richardson had an apartment building constructed on his land. It was a functional apartment building with 8 suites, each consisting of 3 rooms and a bath. Before 1898, a home was erected in Salem, Massachusetts to cut off the view of a neighbor. After the owner died, his heirs agreed in 1898 to have the Salem Spite House torn down to avoid a vexatious lawsuit with the obnoxious neighbor. In the 19th century, a Collinsville, Connecticut butcher feuded with his neighbor. To spite his neighbor, the butcher built between their adjoining houses a narrow, 2-story structure with windows covered by Venetian blinds. The wooden building located between 23 and 25 River Street was the width of a standard stairway and allowed the butcher to block the sun to the neighbor's home and block the neighbor's view of the butcher's property at will. The butcher's son got along with the family next door and eventually tore down the Collinsville Spite House. Also in the 19th century, a Freeport, New York developer who opposed all of Freeport being laid out in a grid, put up a Victorian house virtually overnight on a triangular plot at the corner of Lena Avenue and Wilson Place to spite the grid designers. The Freeport Spite House is still standing and occupied. At the turn of the 20th century, the city of Alameda, California took a large portion of Charles Frilling's land to build a street. Frilling had planned to build his dream house on the plot of land he received through inheritance. To spite the city and an unsympathetic neighbor, Frilling built a house 10 feet deep, 54 feet long and 20 feet high on the tiny strip of land left to him. The Alameda Spite House is still standing and occupied. In 1904, the family of a deceased Joseph Idleston owned a plot of land next to the churchyard of St. Mary's in Gainford, England. The children asked to erect a monument in the churchyard in memory of Joseph's 41-year tenure at the church. The church refused permission, asserting that the churchyard was full but that the family could donate their land to the church and then build a monument on part of it. Feeling slighted, the family immediately set about building themselves a house on their land with a 40-foot column erected next to the churchyard so it towered over the trees. The Idleston Spite House is still standing and occupied, and has MCMIV over the front door. In 1908, Francis O'Reilly owned an investment parcel of land in West Cambridge, Massachusetts and approached his abutting land neighbor to sell the land for a gain. After the neighbor refused to buy the land, O'Reilly built a 308-square-foot building, measuring 37 feet long and only 8 feet wide to spite the neighbor. The O'Reilly Spite House is still standing and is occupied by an interior decorating firm as of mid-2009. Before 1914, the Austro-Hungarians who ruled Sarajevo and Bosnia and Herzegovina wanted land in the Sarajevo Old Town district to build a city hall and library. The land had a home on it and, despite offering the owner money, he refused and continued to refuse even when told that he had to move. When the officials threatened him, he moved the house and rebuilt it, piece by piece, on the other side of the Miljacka River, as a way of spiting the officials. The Sarajevo Spite House operates today as a restaurant called Anatgoa. In 1925, a Montlake, Seattle, Washington neighbor made an insultingly low offer for a tiny slice of adjoining land. Out of spite for the low offer, the builder built an 860-square-foot house which blocked the neighbor's open space. The house is 55 inches wide at the south end, and 15 feet wide at the north end. The Montlake Spite House is still standing and occupied. In the 1950s, two Virginia City, Nevada neighbors got into a dispute. When one of the men built a new house, the other bought the lot next to it and built a house less than 12 inches from his neighbor's house in spite to deprive the neighbor of both view and breeze. The Virginia City Spite House is still standing and occupied. In 1985, a Sunrise, Florida homeowner painted his home hot pink and passionate purple to spite the city, which had given him several tickets for parking his glass company vans overnight in front of his home, in violation of a city code related to residential night parking of commercial vehicles. Characterized as a spite house painted in retaliation against the city, the pink and purple paint job was deemed the owner permitting graffiti or other inscribed materials to remain, and likely violate the Sunrise City Code section prohibiting eyesores that also were public nuisances. A resident in the inland city of Toowoomba, Australia had his application to make his house double-story denied. In protest against the regional council he painted his house pink and adorned it with various pig apparel including nose and tail. The house then became known as the Pig House. After losing an appeal to the council, the enraged owner then purchased 3 scrap cars and positioned them like slanted obelisks in his lawn. The house, positioned on a busy street in the city across from the main park, attracted a lot of attention to the matter. The Sam Key Building in Vancouver, British Columbia. The city widened the street and took a large part of Mr. Key's land, who then built a 4 feet 11 inches wide building on the remaining very small parcel of land. In 2001 in the city of Lubbock, Texas, a landlord and his 4 Texas Tech University student tenants were cited for violating a city ordinance that prohibited more than 2 unrelated people living together. The 4 men were sharing the house to save money on rent. In protest over the next few years, the house was painted several times in bright colors, each iteration even more bold than the last, culminating in purple with black and yellow polka dots and bright green trim. In 2003, Stan Pike was denied a request to build a rounded porch on a house he owned in Avondale Estates, Georgia by the local Historic Preservation Commission. In protest of what he considered an unfair decision, he painted the house a bright green color, with purple dots. In 2009, West Lafayette, Indiana city inspectors informed a property manager that a Chauncey Hill dwelling needed aesthetic improvements. In response, the manager asked the lessees to paint the house bright pink, as there were no city codes governing paint shades for houses. In 2013, Aaron Jackson, an LGBT rights advocate and founder of Planting Peace, purchased a home across the street from the Westboro Baptist Church, a church widely known for its anti-LGBT viewpoints and protests. After accidentally discovering the home was for sale while looking at the church with Google Maps, he immediately decided to purchase it and paint it colors similar to the rainbow flag. Jackson noted the popularity of the house to tourists, stating, "Usually people come here to check out the church, now the attention is on this house." Other uses. The term spite house also relates to an old southern United States custom of consigning an ostracized family member to a very small second house on the family land, where he was expected to live in solitude as punishment for having embarrassed his family. The term has been publicized on the BBC television series QI as one of their gag topics in an extended version of the show. See also. References. Further reading: McGovern, Anne. Jerberg, Mort, February 1980. Mr. Skinner's Skinny House Publisher, Atheneum. ISBN 0-02-765730-2, external links, Prospect Avenue Spite House of 1880 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, shown here. 1, is item number 21 on this Milwaukee historical building map, and discussed here. 2.